Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. The name Seeking Rents comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So I am recording this on day 95 of Florida's 60-day legislative session. Yes, you heard those numbers right. Day 95 of 60. We are still in a ditch down here in Florida in a budget stalemate in the Florida legislature that has now gone on for more than a month. Although that said, this was actually a pretty busy week in Tallahassee. Lawmakers in the House and Senate were finally both back in the Capitol together and working out negotiations on a final state budget. So it's looking like maybe a week or so from now, we might actually get out of this session purgatory we've been in for 35 days and counting now. We're gonna talk a bit about some of the budget developments in just a bit, but I wanted to start today's show with something else, and I don't want to be too melodramatic here, but I really do think like Florida politics fundamentally changed this week. You know, there used to be an unwritten rule in the Florida Capitol in Tallahassee, kind of a bipartisan consensus. Bipartisan is probably not the important part of that. You know, for as long as I've been doing this, Republicans have been in complete control of state government, so it really only matters what Republican Party lawmakers and leaders think. But there has been a cross-party consensus within the Republican Party too, that you do not fuck with the University of Florida. To some extent, it's also true of Florida State University. The two, in some respects, go hand in hand in Florida politics, although the University of Florida is certainly the first among equals in that relationship. And there are, I think, a couple of reasons for that. The first one is obviously UF has been the state's top university for a long time, the flagship school. And it has, at this point, produced a large network of really powerful alumni, wealthy and powerful people in basically all corners of Florida, right? Whether you're talking about government or business or philanthropy or whatever it is, you're going to find UF people at or near the top making decisions. And that network of alumni fights really hard for UF, right? They advocate for its interests. They defend it against attacks. Many of these people serve in leadership positions within the legislature itself, right? This is the most common sort of alma mater of people in the legislature. And so they defend, you know, I say that. I think that's true. I should say I don't have data to back that up, but it just feels like every third speaker or Senate president is a UF alum. But anyway, they defend the university. The university has a lot of friends in powerful places, and they defend it and advocate for it in all sorts of ways. You know, this is a podcast that is in many ways devoted to calling out the most powerful special interests in Florida politics. You know, your Florida Power and Lights, your U.S. Sugars, your Publixes, you know, the biggest rent seekers of all in the state. You know, the University of Florida is as powerful a special interest as any of them. But I think it goes just beyond sort of like parochial sort of alma mater interest. I really do think a lot of like serious-minded people, whether or not you went to UF or not, both in the legislature, in all sorts of positions of power in Florida, have understood the importance of having a major, internationally recognized, prestigious public university. Generally, having a really well-regarded public university system altogether has been kind of a cross-partisan sort of agreement for most of my time following this stuff, but particularly the flagship being one of the top universities, making it one of the top universities in the country was really important to Florida's interests in a whole variety of ways. You know, economically, obviously top tier universities, a major economic driver. It's an important lure for some of the best minds around. You know, these are people that could go anywhere, and you want them to come to Florida and start adding to the economy and the creative fabric in the state. You know, there's also like obviously Florida as a state and the Florida legislature can be a pretty like gonzo place, right? I mean, this is the state that pioneered stand your ground laws, and sort of Florida's kind of caricature reputation on the global stage is the home of Florida man, you know, the sort of crazy kind of stuff like that. the University of Florida being sort of a well-known symbol of academic excellence, of research, a prestigious place, played a really important role in showing, Florida as the serious side of Florida, that Florida is a place to be taken seriously. And when, you're talking about things like recruiting businesses to Florida or something like that, that's really important. And so, you know, for as wild as some of the policy ideas and some of the things that the Florida legislature can do, they generally always stopped short of really doing anything that could like harm the image or the reputation or overtly interfere with the University of Florida. It was just it was a sacred cow within Florida politics, and I would say for good reason. I got no real love for Gator sports teams or anything like that, but you know, even I sort of understood how important it was to have the University of Florida be as strong as possible. And so, like, just to give you one example, so a few years ago, a guy by the name of Jose Oliva became Speaker of the State House. He's a Republican from Miami. He was owned or was his family owned a cigar business, and when he came into power, he kind of like, speaking of sacred cows, he had two sacred cows he really wanted to take on. One was nonprofit hospitals, and the other was public universities. I spent a lot of time talking to people in his circle at the time, and they made a lot of good points about nonprofit hospitals. They absolutely do sort of abuse their nonprofit status. I would also say that it just so happens that a lot of Jose Oliva's agenda seemed to align with HCA, the nation's largest for-profit hospital chain. But he had some good ideas, and on the university side, there was like legitimate frustration that Florida had been just throwing money into universities, and kind of like this was as like a consensus was sort of developing on the right that like perhaps people had pushed too hard in the direction of like everybody has to go to college, and kind of devaluing sort of like trade education and stuff like that. We can debate the merits of that, but there was some policy thinking behind it. But he also just seemed to genuinely have a grudge with universities for whatever reason. Anyway, so Jose Oliva came to power planning to take those two things on. And right about that time, the University of Central Florida here in Orlando, a much less protected school, stumbled into like what to this day remains one of the stupidest scandals we've had in Florida, at least in my time. And this, I got a few cobwebs in my brain, so I might be getting like a couple of the specifics wrong, but this is sort of directionally right. The university got caught using some leftover operational money that it had gotten through the state budget and was left near the end of the year to finish construction of an academic building on campus. Essentially, it took a little bit of operation money and used it for capital costs, right? Like the sort of thing, you're not supposed to do that, right? There's a reason we have different pots of money, but also who cares, right? It was money for academics that was used for an academic purpose, just not the one that the legislature intended necessarily. That the Florida House of Representatives blew its top over this, led by Jose Oliva. They essentially did like a public tar and feathering of UCF and its leader at the time. There was a relatively new university UCF president at the time, so he didn't have kind of the strong relationships in Tallahassee that perhaps could have protected him this. But what became clear as all that was happening is the House was looking for someone to make an example of, and the University of Central Florida just kind of climbed into this. This for anyone who's around in this time, you might remember Randy Fine, who has got all the subtlety of a hammer, made news by claiming he was thinking about working on a plan to shut down the University of Central Florida at the time, right? Again, because they spent a little operational money on a capital project. That's why we were going to shut down the whole institution. Like it was bananas. But this was kind of the vibe in the House and the direction they were pushing. Anyway, as this sort of unfolded, it also came out that the University of Florida had done the same thing. It had used some operational money for capital costs. And you might wonder what happened to the University of Florida after we just saw like essentially a public execution at UCF over the same thing. Nothing. In fact, the whole thing just kind of died down right about then. They just sort of decided they'd gotten their pound of flesh and they'd just taken it all out of UCF. And that was because, again, you don't fuck with the University of Florida. Like you can do some university reform and stuff like that, but you can make like a partisan or a political case against university funding, but you're not going to do anything that is going to screw with like the progress that UF was making as it tried to like climb the rankings and stuff. And so all this stuff fell by the wayside. The UF, the University of Florida, and again to a certain extent FSU, were sacred cows, right? And for good reason. And just to be clear, this wasn't always like they didn't always use their power for good. Like I remember for years talking to folks that represented the state's second tier universities like UCF, like the University of South Florida in Tampa, and they were constantly like trying to get some of the funding that the state would throw at UF and FSU, trying to get some of the funding for themselves so they could keep, sort of climbing and investing in, research and academic programs, that sort of stuff. And they would often run into like UF and FSU lobbyists kind of like cutting them off at the knees, right? There was like, UF would often use its privileged status, not necessarily for good, for like the greater good, right? But regardless, this status existed. This idea that like we all agree that we want UF to be as strong as possible. We don't want to do anything that might sort of like jeopardize its reputation or its image. So, and I think that's over now. I think that ended today, or that ended this week. And so what I'm referring to here is I have to imagine that the vast majority of people that are listening to this podcast have been sort of bathing in this tea all week. But the University of Florida had a vacancy for its president, and it went through a search, and it ended up the board of trustees for the university selected a guy by the name of Santa Ono, who had been the president of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which is an even higher ranked public university, like a school that UF has been modeling itself after and trying to pursue. They got the president of that university to apply for their job, and they nominated him. Now, this was there were some reasons to not be sort of thrilled with how this played out. The University of Florida abused a state law again. A couple of years ago, the legislature passed a law lobbied for by Ron DeSantis and UF's board chair to make presidential searches secret. The compromise in this was they were supposed to like the anybody who applied and they considered was kept confidential from the state's public records law until they got to the finalist stage, and then the final group of finalists was supposed to become public at least like I think it was 2 or 3 weeks before a vote on who to hire. And what UF has done now twice is only put one person in that final group. So like I mean it was a shitty way they picked this guy, but he was qualified. You could not argue that he didn't make sense as the University of Florida's next president. I mean, he was literally the head of a place that they are trying to become more like, right? So this guy gets essentially picked by the selection committee and ratified unanimously by the University of Florida's Board of Trustees, which is a bunch of political appointees, by the way. But then it also has to get approved by another body called the Board of Governors, which oversees the whole state university system. And again, another board of political appointees, most of them appointed by the governor. I think most of them. There might be a little wrinkle in there. Most, if not all, appointed by the governor. But in the meantime, in the kind of like week or two window between when the UF trustees signed off on him and before it came to a vote, Santa Ono became like essentially a project of the Trump right. So you had a bunch of MAGA Republicans came out against him because they essentially felt like he didn't sufficiently hate black people enough. He didn't hate women enough. He didn't hate Palestinian supporters enough. It was all couched around he wasn't anti-DEI enough. I mean, wherever you land on the DEI stuff, and to be clear, diversity is a good thing. It's insane that we've gotten to a position where we treat DEI like a bad word. But wherever you land on it, it's probably not the most important thing that you should be thinking about a candidate's position on DEI when you're choosing who to run one of the most important institutions in the state. You probably ought to be considering sort of bigger picture, more important things than that, I would argue. But these guys decided this guy was too woke to be the president of the University of Florida, and launched a campaign to stop him. And it still blows my mind that this is why they ended up rejecting this guy. The Board of Governors ended up rejecting him, and just sort of like a shocking, I think the vote was 10-6. 10-6, they rejected him. Again, solely on his because he wasn't sufficiently anti-DEI. Also, by the way, this guy had basically said all the things you needed to say. He kind of disavowed all that stuff, said his thinking had evolved. I mean, the one thing I'll give like the MAGA mouth breathers that went after him on this stuff was, I can see why you wouldn't buy his conversion. It seemed so, the guy seemed to like sort of change on a dime in that sort of sense to try and get this job. But where we'll disagree is that this is the thing we should be thinking of about when we're deciding who should lead the University of Florida. But regardless, they ended up rejecting him in what was just a rawly political vote. There was like also some griftery stuff in there. Scott Maxwell of the Orlando Sentinel just wrote a column about this. It turns out one of the guys on the blog had secretly tried to get himself hired as the university president. Paul Renner, another fucking politician looking for a payday on a public payday, he had approached the UF board chair about potentially being hired as the University of Florida's new president, and seems to have gotten laughed out of the room. So at least that's a positive development. But then Renner became one of the most vocal critics of Santa Ono and sort of helped lead the charge to derail his selection. And so it was, like I said, this was a shocking vote. It was to the point where the guy who chairs the chair of the BOG, after the vote happened, he said something like, "That's never happened before." They had to kind of like collect themselves to figure out where do they go next, and there's been a lot of like hand wringing since then about, what an embarrassment this was for Florida, what an embarrassment this was for the University of Florida, how this may have like fundamentally altered UF's image. It is hard to believe that the state of Florida is going to attract a genuinely accomplished academic, particularly someone at any kind of other safe institution right now. Who knows how this ultimately unfolds, but we're headed down like this dark path of University of Florida President Laura Trump or something like that, And like I said, I think I said a couple of times, this was a shocking vote, but as I was thinking about it more, it was inevitable. When you look at what Ron DeSantis has done to the state university system over the last 4 years or so, the way he has turned it into an explicitly political appendage of his administration, he's commandeered them. He has turned like university jobs into, to quote the Speaker of the State House, into a spoils system. He's using them to like reward flunkies and to solve like political problems. Like, I'll give you two examples that have always struck me as like really gross, but also show how we ended up here. So there was a couple of years ago, there was an opening at a tiny state college, a community college in like one of the most rural parts of the state, right? This is South Florida State College, and they had been going through the process to hire their presidential position was open. They'd been going through the process, and they had 3 finalists, all of them accomplished people. They were, all academics with plenty on their resume. The governor's office, as these finalists were supposed to come in for campus visits and interviews, the governor's office stepped in and made them shut down the search. And like within days of doing that, all 3 finalists like withdrew. It was clear that they had been told, "You're not getting this job." The governor's office then forced South Florida State College to do another search and made them lower their job requirements. They initially required their president to have an advanced degree. They made them drop that requirement. Also, they could give the job to this like mediocre state representative from the Orlando area, a Republican by the name of Fred Hawkins. One of the most memorable things he ever did is, you might remember when Ron DeSantis was doing his feud with Disney and sort of commandeered control of their municipal district out there. He made a joke about building a prison at Disney, sort of threatening Disney with all kinds of retaliation. Fred Hawkins stood grinning next to his side while he did all this. And so they made this guy, they lowered the job requirements. Also, they could make this guy the president of a community college. Like, you are treating that place like dirt, right? You just want to reward outs. You could care less about the students when you do that sort of thing. And sort of similarly, then you get to Florida Atlantic University, which is a much bigger university, right? Like, this one, even Ron DeSantis himself has admitted to this. They were in the middle of a presidential search, and again, it got commandeered by the governor's office. Also, it could make Randy Fine president of the university, right? DeSantis has since come out. This created an uproar because Randy Fine is one of those guys that people have strong reactions to. That guy. He elicits strong reactions. Might have to do with his constant sort of escalatory rhetoric, but there was a full-throated rebellion to this, and eventually it failed, right? And he had to back down. And DeSantis himself has since come out and said he has claimed that people wanted to get Randy Fine out of the legislature because they disliked him so much. And so he was trying to help out the legislature by moving Randy Fine into the presidency of Florida Atlantic University. Just think about that for a second. Ron DeSantis cared so little about the state's universities, about Florida Atlantic University, that he was willing to use the presidency there as a dumping ground just to get rid of a politician he didn't like and other people he said didn't like. Again, you care nothing about the students at these universities. You care nothing about the success of these institutions when you're willing to take a guy that you yourself now say made no sense for this just because it helped solve a political problem in the moment for you, allegedly, right? And when you treat these institutions like this, of course, eventually people were going to come to devalue UF too, right? Like you you can't just treat every other university like it's just another political appointment, right? And then expect people to not then think all university presidencies are like this. So of course it was inevitable that the University of Florida got caught up in this shit too, right? And I mean, you treat every institution, academic institution in the state like a joke. You're eventually going to fill them all with clowns. That's the world we're at right now. And as I've been thinking about this, you could make an argument that this had kind of already happened to UF when they hired Ben Sasse, the former U.S. senator from Nebraska. But I do think that was a bit of a different beast. Ben Sasse ultimately proved to be a disaster, obviously, but you can't argue that he wasn't sort of qualified for that job. He was a guy, he had been president of a small university himself. He had a PhD, so he'd been an accomplished academic. He had experience in that world. He'd been a U.S. senator for some time. I will bet all that I own that he was not the strongest candidate for that job, which is why they passed that law where they could make these searches secret. And the first time that UF played this game of, oh, we've got one finalist for the job, they essentially abused this law to pick Ben Sasse in secret. But and that I do think that did a lot of damage. UF playing that game right off the bat with that new law did almost as much as things like the Randy Fine and the Fred Hawkins appointments did to sort of get people thinking about these university jobs as just purely political appointments and not thinking about the bigger picture about the importance of public universities generally and the University of Florida specifically. But I don't think until today, until this happened, the rejection of Santa Ono on because he wasn't sufficiently, by claiming he was too woke for the job and ignoring all other credentials the guy brought to the table, that's the moment that things forever changed in Florida politics on this point. I just, that was just raw politics taking over that search and becoming the only thing people cared about when choosing this filling this position. Like, I mean, you cannot argue that UF is not under complete political control at this point in a way that I genuinely don't think it had been until this point. So, and I don't know how this changes at this point. I don't know when or if the fever on this stuff ever breaks. You don't want to be like Boy You Cried Wolf or Chicken Little or something. But I don't know that this ever comes back. That we may hit the point this could be like generational damage that is happening to Florida right now because of the way we've allowed essentially a bunch of sort of politically self-interested hacks that lack any sort of ability to think further ahead or to think about any interest about their other than their own. We've allowed them to just commandeer these things, and so for anybody who didn't get loud about Fred Hawkins getting installed at South Florida State College, for anybody that didn't get loud about New College being completely commandeered in a political way and trying to turn into an explicitly political institution, for anybody that didn't say anything about the insanity of trying to foist Randy Fine and FSU, you bear some responsibility for this. Congratulations. You've allowed the University of Florida to get sucked into this black hole too. So anyway, the budget. So the legislature back in Tallahassee, like I mentioned, working to finish up a state budget. There's still a really weird vibe in Tallahassee where it does not feel like the House and Senate are still completely on the same page. I was expecting sort of a lot more progress on the budget this week during sort of what they call conference meetings when rank and file House and Senate members allegedly are negotiating parts of the budget. I mean, I say allegedly because in the legislature, every decision gets made by leadership. But you didn't see as much movement as you necessarily suspected. So we're going to end up with, there's going to be a potential for a lot of last minute surprises over the next week or so, because this is just going to be all decided in secret between the House Speaker and the Senate President. One of the things, just a couple of things that jumped out at me this week is you can still see The Senate seems to have adopted a strategy of trying to like hug Ron DeSantis as tightly as possible at this point in hopes that whatever sort of veto action he takes that he'll spare, the Senate president's priorities or Senate priorities or something. And when I say that, like, you know, for instance, the Senate out of the blue put I think $13 million into its education budget for this civics program that's really important to the governor. This is kind of this bonus program, civics training program he developed with help from Hillsdale College people. Like, speaking of politicizing public education, and that where teachers can get bonuses if they go through this kind of civics training program. There was initially no money in either budget coming into budget conference here, and the Senate's immediately dug up $13 million for that. There's another line in the Florida Department of Law Enforcement budget. The Senate is looking to give another $4 million to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for aviation operations. And when you like track down the budget documents on that, that is literally to provide continued safe and uninterrupted flight for the governor and the first family, right? So this is $4 million to let the governor continue flying all over the place on the taxpayer dime, right? So the Senate seems to have pretty clearly adopted a strategy of hiding behind Ron DeSantis's legs on this stuff. The House, meanwhile, seems to be as antagonistic as ever. So they have dropped, a lot. There's been a lot of attention on the Hope Florida scandal, where the DeSantis administration diverted $10 million from a legal settlement with a Medicaid contractor through the Hope Florida Foundation, a charity sort of spearheaded by the governor's wife, and then immediately kicked that money off to a couple of dark money nonprofits that were helping fund the governor's campaign against Amendment 3. This House has dropped some language into its budget offers that essentially would force the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which was behind this Hope Florida legal settlement, Medicaid legal settlement, would force them to start providing a bunch of financial data and details around Medicaid to the House and Senate going forward, like a bunch of documentation that the governor's office has been really slow to provide, and to give it teeth, they want to withhold the AHCA secretary, the Agency for Healthcare Administration secretary, withhold her salary until the agency enters into these data and information sharing agreements and starts providing that. One of the funniest moments of the week came when that language showed up. So each one of these conferences, they happen in different, they call them budget silos. So like the Healthcare Budget Conference Committee had met, and this language came up. And at the end of each meeting, like a bunch of reporters go running up to talk to the two chairs, just ask a few questions about, because you're basically just like given a spreadsheet with hundreds of line items and trying to figure out what everything is. And so a reporter immediately asked about this. And before the House guy, the Alex Andrade, the House rep who's leading the healthcare budget negotiations, Jay Trumbull, the state senator who's doing this, jumped in there to like stress, like, it's important to know that we haven't agreed to this yet. Like it was almost like he was talking directly to the governor's office. Like, look, we're not saying yes to this. Don't hold this against us. And there's lots of kinds of things like that in the Department of Management and Services budget. The House wants to prohibit any taxpayer funding for travel costs by remote employees. That's been a big fight with the Secretary of DMS, like racking up a bunch of travel expenses because they don't live in Tallahassee. I think I'm getting that right. I'll dig up a story about that and drop it into the show notes just so you can see what I'm talking about. And on the civic stuff and the FDLE flying the governor and his family around, the House doesn't have any of that money in its budget. So, the House seems to be going down a much different road than the Senate. So it's still not clear to me how we stitch those things together in a way that like doesn't lead either to the budget collapsing again or the Senate sort of getting caught with all the veto shrapnel that we can kind of all assume is probably coming from the governor. The only two policy issues that I wanted to call it, there's lots of, obviously these are like $115 billion budgets, so there's tons of stuff in these things, but two things that I think are interesting and still somewhat unresolved. The House has been pushing hard to put more money into the state's Schools of Hope program. This is a really controversial program where essentially charter school operators can bypass all kind of like local approval stuff and get sort of like automatically open up within near persistently struggling schools. And they create all sorts of issues about potentially like cherry picking students. It's just like I said, it's a very controversial program, and the House wants to put $6 million into basically helping more Schools of Hope operators open up schools around the state. And part of the reason that's interesting is back on day 60, when kind of like the regular part of the session ended, because generally speaking, almost all the policy bills are supposed to be, anything that didn't pass yet is supposed to be dead now. The House unveiled this like massive expansion of the Schools of Hope program that nobody had seen before. I mean, it was a breathtaking expansion, literally breathtaking. I guess that's not literally using wrong, but it was a massive potential expansion of this program that nobody had seen before, hadn't been vetted anyway. It ended up not passing, but this seems like, like I said, the theoretically we're not supposed to be doing policy at this point. This is all supposed to be budget stuff, but there are the budget comes with a bunch of bills attached to it. Sometimes they call them, a lot of them are called conforming bills, or basically like you this is in the weeds, but you're conforming state statutes to decisions you make in the budget. But there is a long history of legislative leaders sticking a bunch of policy, like major policy changes, into these conforming bills, which is like about the most secretive way you can do this, because you don't have to show your hand on budget conforming bills until the very end of session. And then once you do, you can't amend them. They're conference reports, so they're just an up or down vote at the end. And the budget, at the very least, by the Constitution, requires that to be published 72 hours before they vote on it. There's this kind of cooling off period where you can sort of like spend the next few days going the fine tooth comb through it, so like people know what they vote on. That does not exist for these conforming bills. In fact, the other really interesting thing that jumped out at me in one of these post-session avails was after an education conference. Jenna Persons-Mullica, probably a Republican state rep who's leading the pre-K-12 education budget negotiations, best known, I think, as the sponsor of Florida's 6-week abortion ban. She was kind of asked about conforming bill question, and she kind of noted that, like, you'll probably see those later. Remember, they don't really have the same requirements. They might not pop until the very end, which is like a chilling thing to hear. And it's just I say all this because I'm not convinced that Schools of Hope expansion that we saw on the last day of session is completely dead. So this is one potentially to keep an eye on. At minimum, you're talking about the House is trying to spend millions of dollars just like subsidizing more Schools of Hope operators. But there could be more about more lurking behind the scenes right now. And the other thing is, this is more of an interesting one. The Senate and the House, I think, has agreed to the number on this, but the Senate budget includes $15 million now. They've agreed. I think the House and Senate both agreed to $15 million to restore the Ocklawaha River in Central Florida. And now there is some language attached to this that I don't think they've agreed on. But this is really interesting, because what this money is about potentially breaching, a more than half-century-old dam, or roughly half-century-old dam in Central Florida that has dammed this river that's a major tributary to the St. Johns River. This has like been one of the biggest environmental controversies in Florida for years. This is a legacy of something called the Cross Florida Barge Canal, where I think this is another thing. I'll throw some good. The Florida Channel has done some really cool sort of documentary style segments on this, so I'll throw a link to one or two of those in the show notes. But I think it was during the Nixon administration, is either when they were doing this or when it finally got shut down. But they tried to build a barge across a barge canal across the Florida Peninsula in North Florida, and this dam was built of the Ocklawaha River was part of it, and it flooded out this giant area. It created something called the Rodman Reservoir, which has become like a big bass fishing sort of a magnet. And so it's in a part of the state where it's like one of the more rural, poorer parts of the state. There's like not a lot economically going on there. So like the fishing industry there has been important. So over the years, there have been attempts to tear the Rodman Dam down. I think it's also called the Kirkpatrick Dam, maybe, after a state senator who supported it. And locals have like fought that for years because of worried about like losing the fishing magnet that the reservoir creates. But this money, if they agree to the language behind it, would pay to at least partially breach the dam and restore more of the natural flow of the Ocklawaha River, which would then like improve water flow into the St. Johns River, where the St. Johns River in that area has all sorts of flooding problems, and also saltwater intrusion has become an increasing problem because it's not getting all the water it should be getting from like the Ocklawaha River. So this is actually potentially really exciting if they do agree on something like this, and this does lead to finally, after I covered I covered the 2006 governor's race, and like a major issue in the Democratic primary was the Rodman Dam and the Ocklawaha River, right? One candidate was from this kind of rural North Florida area, and he supported the dam, refused, like opposed efforts to tear it down, and like that was a defining issue in that Democratic primary. That's 20 years ago. And so the idea that there could be progress on this is really interesting. Now it's got to survive. Even if they finally agree to the language and everything, it's got to obviously survive Ron DeSantis' veto. There was some language in the budget last year for a study around this stuff, and the governor spiked it. This guy. There was a time that he styled himself as a Teddy Roosevelt style of Republican, but he vetoed money last year that could have potentially taken down one of the most environmentally destructive dams in Florida. So any of this is going to have to get through the governor, and who knows there. But that's a potentially really interesting one to keep an eye on. And then just before I go, I do want to talk about one other thing that just happened before I recorded this. Is the governor's administration, the Department of Children and Families. I don't know if they actually even sent this or they just posted online. A reporter at the Orlando Sentinel, a guy by the name of Jeff Schweers, who's like. He's like a really friendly guy. He's a good reporter. He's just a nice sort of like gentle guy in my experience. Has been working on investigating the Hope Florida Foundation. And he's done some really good work sort of exposing kind of the lack of work Hope Florida has done, like some of the success stories that they've claimed turning out to be more marketing than reality. And he's I guess he's been calling folks that have received money from the Hope Florida Foundation. And so the Department of Children and Families, the DeSantis administration, posted a cease and desist letter online today, claiming without any evidence that he was like harassing and threatening threatening families or foster families that were receiving Hope Florida grants. It was wild. I mean, it's one of sort of the most pathetic things I've seen. The letter, which is unsigned, by the way, like all good legal letters, nobody wanted to put their actual name to it. And it had no specifics. It was like all filled with passive voice. And like, it has been learned that this may be happening or this sort of thing. Cease and desist. I've never seen anything like that. And, first of all, keep going, Jeff. You've obviously got their attention. I mean, when someone is screaming at you to stop answering questions, suggests maybe they really do have something to hide. But also, it's just pathetic. Ron DeSantis himself came across the top on this and tweeted, I forget what he said, something like bottom feeder's going to bottom feed, or something like that. Like, again, this like gentle reporter that, like, if you ever talk to him, he's like very friendly. He's not, he's so gentle that I'm not sure if he was threatening me, I'd even realize it. Right. And Ron DeSantis is like picking a Twitter fight with this guy like himself. Like, that's what this guy has to do this time. And this comes after, like, I saw him somewhere on Twitter, like going after some like random commenter who called him a dipshit and like fighting back against him. It's like, what are you doing? This is like the most pathetic thing I think I've ever seen out of a governor. Like this, how far have you fallen from being like, the heir apparent? You're sending like phony threat letters to reporters and arguing with shit posters on Twitter. I should be outraged at this. Like, the state shouldn't be trying to threaten journalists, but they're doing such a pathetic job of it. It's amusing more than anything. But if you ever needed more evidence that the governor is flailing right now, check out that cease and desist letter. It's anyway. It also I've probably never been more convinced that we have not heard the last of this Hope Florida stuff. Like there are more shoes to drop. This is none of this is the behavior of someone with nothing to hide. So anyway, I just wanted to call that out because it was genuinely amusing. Okay, I've been talking way too long, far longer than I expected. We'll be back again sometime next week. I've got an interview podcast lined up for next week, I hope. So we're going to get back and do a couple more of those. Hopefully, now that we're cooling down from session, and we'll obviously be back with more budget updates. So as always, if you can, hit the like or subscribe buttons, however you're consuming this podcast. That's really valuable to helping get the content further out there. If you've got any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Leave a show review or a comment. And then if you haven't already, please think about signing up for the newsletter. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. All of our content is free. None of it is behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford it. So, okay, we'll leave it there and we'll talk again very soon. Take care.